When we launched last spring, we imagined a place where we, Iranian Americans, contribute collectively to our communities, by both locally and nationally. Through the work of volunteers and PAAIA's team, we were able to launch our first civic engagement forum at Johns Hopkins University in DC last June, in addition to hosting 2 regional events at Georgia Tech in Atlanta and Stanford University in the Bay Area. Due to the current COVID-19 pandemic, PAAIA quickly shifted gears to hosting virtual forums like today's, to continue encouraging our community to be involved and engaged. Through the diversity of our community, PAAIA has hosted events on the Census 2020 campaign, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact on small businesses, and providing humanitarian aid to Iran during the pandemic. If we use our collective voice and engage in collective action, we will have a significant impact on Iranian American priorities. We can also contribute to efforts focused on making America a more perfect union. Which brings us to today's discussion. PAAIA's Racial Justice series includes challenging topics, but important ones to cover. While many Iranian Americans may not feel the events following George Floyd's death directly affect them, today's panelists will discuss how the struggle for full inclusion into American society still exists, and why you, as an Iranian American, should care. The series will also cover ways we should be engaged and how we can take action. It is my honor to introduce our moderator for this evening, Shirley Jahad. Shirley is an award-winning public media reporter, anchor, host, and producer. At the PBS nationally broadcast Tavis Smiley Show, Shirley produced wide-ranging segments during this turbulent time of the Trump presidency. Shirley was the lead interviewer for a 2019 web video series on the Iranian diaspora 40 years after the hostage crisis. And for her coverage of underserved communities, she was honored with the Studs Terkel Media Award. Shirley also teaches at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism. But before I hand this off to our very talented moderator, I am obligated to remind everyone to fill out their census. The deadline has been extended to August 11th, and it only takes a few minutes, I promise. Please go to 2020census.gov and also register to vote. And please actually vote in your primary and general elections. Change happens over time, considering multiple factors, 2 of which are determined by census results every 10 years and who represents us in public office. It is your civic duty to participate in both these events. I'll be back at the end of this discussion to remind you again. And with that, hi, Shirley.
Hi, thank you so much, Samira. Thank you all for being here. It's so wonderful to be together today, to come together. And, you know, as you think about our gathering together today, it's just 1 month, a little over 1 month since the murder of George Floyd. And in that time, in just over a month, we've had our protests around the country, in rural areas, in urban areas, in large and small communities. We're seeing lots of different kinds of change, some of it more syrup and some of it more substance. We've had some communities cutting funding to police departments, some allocating money differently. The Minneapolis City Council disbanded the police department and is trying to remake it, and it defunded it and is trying to remake it into a new model. Some communities are taking police out of schools. We're seeing all this and more unfold in so many ways, and many are describing our moment right now as an historic reckoning. So what is the role, what is the place of the Iranian American community, Iranian immigrants, Iranian Americans in this historic time? The Iranian community here has tended to be disparate. We are very diverse religiously. We come from different backgrounds, economically different backgrounds, many different political interests, many different perspectives, both regarding what we view as the future and the makeup and the form of society in America and what it should look like back in Iran. People have so many differing points of view. People even have differing points of view of self-identity, right? Some Iranians identify more as white, other Iranians identify as people of color. So we're going to be diving into so many of these different issues in our conversation, and we're getting different points of view from this extraordinary panel. PAAIA has put together a powerful panel of heavy hitters. And so I'm going to introduce everybody briefly right now, and then we're going to dive into our conversation. So thank you all for being here. Cyrus Mehri, he is a civil rights attorney. His parents among the earliest immigrants to come to the US from Iran. His career has centered on the big cases with a focus on race in the workplace. Lots of precedent-setting victories, some record-setting settlements, and a lot of innovative reforms in those settlements to try and make corporate workplaces more diverse. The cases involve big names in corporate America like Texaco, Coke, Bell, South, and the NFL. Cyrus came up and got schooled with Ralph Nader and was one of Nader's Raiders. So welcome, Cyrus.
Good to be here.
We have Mitra Jalali. She's representing, and she represents. She is an elected official and now sits at the epicenter of a lot of what has been unfolding in the last month. She is a city councilwoman in St. Paul, Minnesota. She was elected in 2018. She's not only fierce and fabulous, but she is also Iranian and Korean. Her parents are Iranian and Korean. And Mitra started as a classroom teacher, a community organizer. She was a staffer for Keith Ellison as a congressman, and then became an elected herself. Welcome, Mitra.
Thank you so much for having me.
Abdi is here. Abdi Soltani is the executive director of the ACLU in Northern California. Abdi was born in LA, and then his parents moved back to Iran, and so he had the chance to live in Iran for 9 years and came back to the US as a 9-year-old. He has spent his career in social justice, an executive director of the Campaign for College Opportunity, a great organization, and before that, executive director of Californians for Justice, which is a grassroots group focusing on immigrant rights, civil rights, education rights. Welcome, Abdi.
Thank you.
And then we have Tehran Von Ghasri to help us laugh, to help make us think. Philosopher, comedian, thinker, stereotype buster. He is African-American and Iranian, and he speaks so beautifully in Persian. He does stand-up comedy in 2 languages, seems to be one of the busiest folks in show business. And on top of that, has a few degrees, including one from Georgetown Law. Welcome.
I appreciate you guys having me. I do want to say that with this illustrious panel, I'm technically the most qualified person on this panel. It's just amazing that amongst all these amazing people, finally, for the first time, I get to be the most qualified. Just being Black and Iranian makes me qualified. And unlike everyone else who's like, it's so good to be here, I think it's horrible that I have to be here. I wish I could be here under other circumstances, but I'm so glad that PAAIA, amongst with certain civic-minded people like yourself, Shirley, and Samira, and everyone else, were able to put together such a much needed and necessary conversation at this time.
Well, let's get started. Thank you, Tehran. We're going to start off by taking a few minutes to hear your story, Tehran, and everybody else's personal experiences, personal stories. We want to hear your personal journey. So Cyrus, we'll start with you. When your parents came to the US, hardly any other Iranians were in America. What was
I don't think they might have been the only ones. My dad and my uncle came in 1947. I'm not aware of any other Iranians. There might have been some that were here at that time. My dad got educated, went back to Iran, met my mother, and then they both came here in 1960. But when my dad first came here, he was at LSU, where he saw racism up front, and being Iranian was not that much different than being African American at that time in terms of how you were treated. And so when my parents really started a family in the early 60s, we kind of grew up with the paradox of race, because they chose to come to America for all the great attributes our country has, you know, the wisdom you could see in our Constitution, but yet in that original Constitution was slavery, and the aftermath of slavery goes on in different ways, generations after generation. So I was very aware of those issues early in life. And then by chance, because a couple of African-American executives at Texaco could not find another lawyer who was willing to take on Texaco because there was such a feared defendant that crushed all the employees whenever they stood up for their rights, they came to me as last resort. And then there you go, I changed my life, and I've been on a mission to try to create a level playing field, try to fight for equal opportunity, try to create innovations for ideas that would help lift people up and give them a chance to compete based on their merits. And so that's been a great privilege for me. And this awakening of the last few weeks has been quite extraordinary, and as sad as I am, I kind of end up feeling mostly hopeful because I see this as a moment of big ideas that we can try to champion to make things right or better going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cyrus. Mitra, you seem like you have been on fire for quite a while with a passion for social issues from an early age. Tell us about your story growing up, how you connected and got involved in these issues.
Well, thank you. You know, my story, I think, starts as a classroom teacher. In 2008, just 3 years after Hurricane Katrina, I became a social studies teacher in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. It was an entirely life-changing experience for me. I'm born and raised in Minnesota. I'm from a 100% classically Minnesotan family in kind of the new sense, like immigrants from two different countries, and born and raised in the Midwest, and I'm representing here now. But when I was a teacher, I saw firsthand what my students went through. And I would say 99% of my students were Black students from New Orleans, very specific cultural history within New Orleans, right? You have Creole heritage, you have the different connections to the Haitian community, there's rebuilding from subsequent environmental racist disasters, there's the history of New Orleans as both a port for the slave trade and also as part of kind of the most cultural gemstone communities in the country. And in all that history, I found myself facing familiar but still problems that are persistent today. My kids were over-policed in their home neighborhoods. They were over-policed in another way at school with non-Black teachers, not just white teachers, but people like me who are non-Black people of color can still be violent towards Black kids because we don't actually understand. It's not the same experience. My kids experienced homelessness. I will never forget my students who came to class because they were sleeping under a bridge and then coming to school and getting in trouble academically. And it was because they literally cannot sleep. And when you don't sleep, that destroys and breaks down your body. It's extremely real. And so many other structural forces. And you can't go through something like that and not be radicalized to understand not just what you can do in the classroom to respond to trauma and to address injustice within education, but to want to work on the structures. And so from there, I followed what I felt was a calling to get involved in politics and policy, and I started working on campaigns for school funding. We organized in 2012 in St. Paul to get $39 million in annual taxpayer money on the table for St. Paul public schools, and to make sure kids of color have what they need in the American public school system. And from there, got to keep working, not just in education, but across issues. So I've had the chance to work now in the course of my life on immigration, on education, healthcare access, and all these parts of policy that touch our lives. And when you look at all the disparities, you consistently see, here's the racial hierarchy that's been built in our country and how capitalism has exploited Black and Indigenous people. And I personally, as the kid of Iranian immigrants, have worked to find my racial position over time, even as an American-born kid, because just because you enter as an immigrant doesn't mean you are on the same footing as folks who are struggling and making their way here. There is still a way we are treated if we are not Black that the American political class gladly exploits and uses to divide and conquer. We need to unpack that. So I know we'll spend the panel talking about that, but I'm a city council member now, and I'll talk more throughout the course of the panel about what we've been through in Minnesota, my colleagues across the river in Minneapolis, my friends, my loved ones, my community. We have been through an incredibly painful month, but there's also hope here. I will tell you there's a lot of determination. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation and hoping to do my part and call us all to do our part. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We love your fire and we appreciate your time being here and spending it and sharing it with us. Thank you, Mitra. Abdi, you have written that in your experience coming to these issues, you witnessed another era of people being in the streets in the aftermath of the Rodney King beating and then the verdict. Was that a big influence for you to enter the world of social justice, or what led you to your path?
Yeah, so I'll start with this part with the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of those officers. I was a freshman in college in the Bay Area at the time, and I had grown up, was born in Los Angeles, as you mentioned. I grew up in Iran. We moved to Massachusetts. And in the public school that I attended in Massachusetts, there were 2 or 3 Black students in my class who were part of the busing program from downtown Boston to the suburb that I lived in. So I knew those students. I was friendly with them, but I didn't grow up around a lot of Black people. I didn't know a lot of Black folks. I moved into a suburb of Boston that was predominantly, overwhelmingly white. At any rate, so when I came out to the Bay Area for college, it was the year in which Rodney King was acquitted. And my dorm was next to the Black themed dorm on my campus called Ujima House. And I got involved in being an ally and supporting the Black students organizing and the marches and the mobilizations that came of it. And that experience changed the trajectory of my life. I decided that I want to commit myself to social justice, racial justice being quite central to it. And then when I graduated from college, I went into community organizing. So, try explaining at the Iranian American relatives dinner parties what a community organizer is before Barack Obama was known publicly as a community organizer. There's Iranians choose all sorts of paths, and I chose mine in community organizing. And through those experiences, I met the most incredible people. We did a lot of work with Black residents, youth, adults, and elders, as well as with Latinos, Laotian immigrants, other Asian immigrants, exposed to Native American communities, all different walks of life. So it's been a great gift to me, the opportunity to work with such diverse communities, to be welcomed into so many different people's homes and families, to hear people's stories of their resilience and how they've lived in this country, their ancestors, how they've shaped its path. So I'll talk more in other parts of the conversation, but I have felt so much privilege by virtue of having been in relationship with the full future face that is the current face of the United States, the full diversity of this country. And it's shaped my outlook of what America can be. And as much as I respect elements of this country's constitution or its founding, it's the future that we create together that is the America I'm committed to. So I'm excited to be here together, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Abdi. Tehran, you are, like Mitra, one of the sort of first generation mixed Iranian Americans, and you embody two powerful cultures that are also targeted cultures. So tell us how you navigated that as a kid growing up. Did you grapple with fitting in, not fitting in, and how did that mold you, give you a point of view that you take to the stage now in your comedy?
Navigated, I'm still dealing with it. What do you mean navigated? I'm still trying to survive, you people. Why do you think I went and learned how to speak Farsi? I wanted to know what you all were saying about me behind my back, in front of my face. That's why I speak such great Farsi. People need to understand that. And just to understand, growing up in both these cultures means that I got and was subjected to racism from all around, and not just from without, but from within as well, because you have cultures that do not necessarily understand each other, and there are a lot of everyone is aware of aggressive racism, the Klan or Nazis, but there are certain microaggressions which are racist comments that are derogatory or negative, in which the person using them may not even be aware that they're doing so. It's something as simple as an elderly Iranian woman coming up to me and saying, "Tehran, you're so good looking for a Black." That's a microaggression. That's something that gets used often. And so it'll be interesting to see where this conversation goes. I would vote for any three of the people that spoke before me, Abdi, Cyrus, and Mitra. They seemed amazing. Cyrus, I do unfortunately want to let you know that in the 1600s, that's the first recorded Iranian American who actually went to Jamestown, Virginia as a tobacco farmer. So that's a thing. And then by the 1900s, there was about a group of 150 here, which is a whole thing. I used to love this kind of stuff. So it's interesting. Wow. Being Black in Iranian is a very interesting and unique perspective. And I can't wait to share, I guess.
Cyrus, were you about to say something?
I was just going to say that I never in a million years would have taken us back to Jamestown. So thank you, Tehran, for educating us.
Well, I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, and right outside Virginia is where I actually went to high school. And so we learned a lot about colonial America, and especially Jamestown. And when I found out that there was an Iranian immigrant who was actually Iranian Armenian, who was possibly the first Iranian to migrate to the United States, I was very interested and intrigued.
All right, we're all going to be looking that up now. Thank you so much. So clearly, you know, all of you spoke with passion. All of you found passion with this direct involvement in the civil rights and justice issues that you're involved in. And some Iranians in the U.S., you know, we're a diverse community. Some are newer immigrants. Some have been here a long time. Like a lot of immigrant groups, some, you know, think, what do these issues have to do with me? You know, others recognize that it could be argued that there's a clear path, right? Direct line between civil rights efforts of African Americans and the efforts to make America a more perfect union, right? And doors opening for Iranians and Latinos and Asians and women and other folks of color as a result of the hard-won efforts of African Americans striving for equal rights. So that suggests a huge debt of gratitude owed. Perhaps Cyrus and then Abdi help explain it further, maybe bring all that up to the present. Cyrus, you were just in a court fight against the Muslim ban not too long ago. I assume arguing that case and using civil rights laws that were passed
Right.
as a result of civil rights movement and African Americans' efforts, right?
Yes, well, in that very first week of the travel ban, the Iranian American community, particularly the lawyers, really gathered to fight it. And I was lucky to be part of that effort and help represent PAAIA and other organizations in federal court. But it brings home, I think, the answer to your question, Shirley, why should we care so much about this? Well, we benefit as a diaspora, 1 million strong or so in the US, by the entire civil rights movement. In fact, probably most of us wouldn't be here but for the civil rights movement in 1965, leading to the broadening of immigration laws. So Asians around the world, people not from Northern Europe can come to the US. So the entire diversity of America today largely comes from that 1965 act modifying the immigration laws. Then you get into moments like now where increasingly in my lifetime, I wouldn't have guessed this, but starting with the hostage crisis, then Iranians being pointed out as part of the axis of evil, and then the travel ban, and now the rise of hate crimes that we're seeing around the country. Iranian Americans are targeted right now, and we are benefiting from civil rights laws, and that's what we best, you know, our particular case on the travel ban was focused on that. But another reason I think we should be part of the dialogue and really care is I think Iranian Americans have a lot to add to the dialogue, that their experiences, many of the first generations are people who lived in Iran and then came here, can share some of these experiences that can help add to the dialogue. And then I think that we have a duty, Shirley, you mentioned a more perfect union. Well, I think this paradox of race in America and the challenge it's brought year after year, century after century in this country, we have a duty to help make this country a more perfect union and to wrestle with and come up with some better answers on these really difficult issues. So I think I'm so thankful that PAAIA is doing this seminar, but I hope it's the beginning of a longer term dialogue.
And it is. I think this is the beginning of a series of dialogues. Abdi, what are your thoughts on the question?
You know, I'll just add to what Cyrus said in the following way. I've been, you know, I took American history when I was in 11th grade. I would have studied the Constitution then. I worked in civil rights for a long time, and then I came to ACLU. I've been at the ACLU for 11 years. So take all that time, and I've known the story of my birth since I was probably a toddler. My mom and dad were on a fellowship to the United States in 1973. They intended to stay for about, at most, 5 months, and my mom arrived pregnant with me, and she intended to return to Iran for me to be born there. When they went to the doctor for a checkup before her flight, the doctor said, "You're too far in this pregnancy. This child will be born here in Los Angeles in the United States." So I was born a citizen of the United States, and we returned to Iran, and then later we were able to immigrate, all different visas, all different combinations, but this member of the family could come to the United States as a citizen. I've known that story since probably I was 3 or 4, like at the earliest point I could comprehend it. I've worked for civil rights my whole adult life. There's not a moment since I was 18 that either volunteering or for my work, that's not what I've been doing. But it wasn't until literally 3 years ago And I have here like my pocket constitution that ACLU people carry with us. And I read again the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which is one of the 3 Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but it left open the question of who's a citizen or what rights do free people have. So the 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9th, 1868, and it opens with the following words: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So I didn't put it together that the source of my citizenship in 1973 was the abolition of slavery. So to Cyrus's point, I wouldn't be a citizen were it not for the 14th Amendment. And on the PAAIA website, there's a blog post that I wrote after I called and spoke with Layla about why Black lives should really matter to Iranian Americans. And the 14th Amendment is just one of those aspects. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Immigration Act, those all were passed on the eve of our arrival and our mass migration after the Iranian Revolution. We wouldn't have come, as Cyrus said, were it not for those immigration laws allowing our arrival. And once we faced the discrimination of the hostage crisis, we would not have had the protection based on national origin that the Civil Rights Act allowed. Now, that's not the reason why we should care about Black lives. We should care about Black lives for their own sake. But I think as recent immigrants, Iranian Americans need to understand how much we've benefited from the Black freedom struggles that have spanned the generations before our arrival on these shores.
If I may just point out something specifically, because Abdi pointed something very, very amazing out, is that civil rights movement, which we all attribute to Black people. And of course, everyone knows Martin Luther King. In fact, I've never been quoted Martin Luther King Jr. more ever in my life. Now, all of a sudden, everyone knows Martin Luther King, and people start quoting Martin Luther King when they hear about the protests, and even try to tell me what Martin Luther King would or would not approve of. They love saying this, even though they've actually never read anything he said or done, and also don't realize that King was his last name. It was not his designation amongst Black people. It was not his elected position. He was not the king of Black people. He was simply one of many civil rights leaders at the time. And it's the one who history has decided, because it was the safest to speak about. But even when we talk about that 13th Amendment, let's not forget the 13th Amendment's ruling, which exempts penal labor from that and the prohibition of forced labor. So while it removes slavery, it opens it up for the prisons, which is one of the biggest discriminatory rulings of the history of America. Is the 13th Amendment, is by placing, we're gonna end slavery, but what we can do is just start putting people in jail and start creating a jail system, which is basically a form of slavery, which is one of the reasons why Black people go to jail for almost 5 times more than the average person. That's the concept why 1 in 3 Black people will also find themselves in jail in that same system. And that civil rights that everyone takes for granted is not just the Black rights movement, much like how Black Lives Matter is not just Black Lives movement. Black Lives Matter means LGBTQ lives. It means Latinx lives. It means immigrant lives. It means Iranian lives, as we saw with the demise and murder of Bijan Qaisar in Washington, D.C. When we saw many of the Black Lives Matter taking up this cause. We've seen this before, even during the Iranian hostage crisis, which I'm sure many people on this call have a recollection of, or at least an awareness of, that lasted 444 days. On the 14th day, those people who shall not be named released the Black hostages, because they released the Black hostages and were like, hey, your country treats you way worse than we do, so we're gonna let you go back. That is a real thing that happened in 1979. On the 14th day, they let those, and then kept everyone else for 444 days, because they knew the American government would have no stock or put no stock in their Black hostages. That's then, and we're still talking about things now. We're reusing chants that we've used in the past. We're using the same slogans. As good as people think things are, they have not changed. And the Iranian community, which at many times sees itself as exempt, you are not. You are not exempt. You're not white. You're just next. So Black lives are simply the front line. But then you will see the domino effect of who will go next. And you all are on that list as well.
Tehran, to your point, I heard an interview, I think, where you said you'd been pulled over. You personally had been pulled over almost 24 times. You said you don't drink at all.
No. This is just recently. I've been pulled over way more than 24 times. I've been arrested several times for reasons. And by the way, every single charge was frivolous. This is a real thing that has happened to me. Another thing that has happened to me is that specifically last year, I received a phone call from a law firm in which a police officer who previously worked at George Mason University, where I attended for undergrad, had brought up a lawsuit, and I was named as one of the people simply because she was attesting that I was targeted while I was in school because the person who at the time and later became the chief had said derogatory statements about me and my origin being half Black and half Iranian, how I'm the most dangerous person on campus. And I was specifically targeted and pulled over constantly to the point where going to school, just the simple act of going to school, going to university to study became a chore. And I was afraid to be on campus. I used to have to get my friends to drive. I've been pulled over several dozen times for what the police officer says is me swerving or drunk driving. I've never drank alcohol in my life. I've never tried any drugs, and I've never smoked anything. And that's not because I have a moral qualm about it. It's because I feel A, it's for my personal safety, and B, it's something that I personally choose not to do. And yet it's something that I'm accused of all the time. You know, it's simple things like people coming up to me and asking me if I have any marijuana. Why would you think that I have the marijuana? Why not ask Cyrus or Abdi, who, by the way, are both hippies and way more likely to have marijuana? Those constant concerns is because tragedy is cumulative. It doesn't happen all at one time. When you look at history, evil doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow progression. It's a slippery slope, as we like to use in legal terms. It starts somewhere, and then inch by inch, the next thing you know, you're out in the middle of the sea, and you were all about to drown. So be aware of those things.
Mitra, thank you, Tehran. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. Amazing that you've been through all of that, and I don't know how you know, when you say tragedy is cumulative, after the 24th and then the 36th and then the 48th time, I don't know how you bounce back. That might be a whole nother video conversation, but thank you for sharing your experience. Mitra, a lot of what our other panelists have just said, you've been experiencing in the last month. Tell us about the connections you're making between immigrant communities, Iranian communities, social justice, and...
Well, yeah, I wanted to jump in and just, I really appreciate what Tehran is bringing to this conversation. And we need to kind of complete the thoughts, and you've completed a lot of those thoughts, and I appreciate that a lot. And I mean, my mind is in a lot of places, but I want to lift up this thread of like, us thinking that we are exempt. I guess like in my time in the Iranian American community, I've seen kind of like two attitudes that are holding us back from participating in like collective liberation, and that are we're neglecting our responsibility to the movement for Black lives and the movement for the America that we believe in. And one of them is the attitude of kind of like exemption and complacency that Tehran named. And I think about, so for example, like Donald Trump passed a Muslim ban, and our community has been in America long enough now that, you know, generations of us can register and vote. But the voting bloc that held the line against Donald Trump was actually Black women. Black women voted really hard for themselves and with an imperfect party and a structure that takes them for granted, and in droves against decades of voter suppression. And yet how many of us like did that work in our communities to get to the polling place and like turn up for our people, like our collective people, not just like us, right? And then like the Muslim ban included Somalia and Iran and also other countries, and now there's subsequent iterations that are all African countries. But when I worked, I mean, I literally worked on the Muslim ban and was like working with teams of airport attorneys in Minneapolis when I was then the Congressional District Office Policy and on Immigration. And I saw, like, I would go out all day and work with lawyers and activists and see like this like multiracial movement fighting. And in our community in Minnesota, we have the largest Somali diaspora community in America. So Somali community is very vocal, very active, very empowered, at the forefront, at leading the fight, right? In a way that is also like for them and for us. But then I go on Facebook and I see my uncles and Iranian relatives writing about like how it's inappropriate to ban us because we're rocket scientists and engineers and we're exceptional and we are like business creators and all these things. And so you shouldn't ban us. And like even in advocating, they're only advocating for ourselves. And they're advocating with exceptional immigrant narratives that throw Somali people under the bus, throw Central American families, all these other groups that are, as someone and many have mentioned, benefit from the immigration laws passed from the Black freedom struggle, but are also still like not realizing the freedom. And we have ICE and we have a deportation machine. We have good and bad immigrant narrative. So those are ways I've seen our community show up to this conversation. And it's always like all about us. This is the first group of Iranians I've ever sat and talked to who knows about the 13th Amendment, even kind of, who acknowledges immigration law. Like, I think our community of non-Black Iranians, I will specify, is very late to this conversation. There is a generational pain point that I've processed with like my peers, my Iranian kid peers, where like my generation are like the 9/11 kids. Like, we came of age under George W. Bush. We were radicalized against imperialism. We were like drawn into movement through like the way that the surveillance state came around us, and then how that connects to like how Black folks are policed in our communities. And like we found a vein to like join. But a lot of our parents like got out of Iran and said, thank God, and now I'm gonna start my business. And like, I love my uncles to death. Like, one of them started All-American Print Shop, which is like, that is so emblematic. It's like you started a random graphic design company and now you just like live in Vegas and that's what you do. And they just like stopped doing politics. They stopped caring about the connections. And as a young person who has the privilege of like being US born and all these other things, I have found and worked hard with my peers to be like, how do we talk to our elders who on a family level gave us everything in a culture that does value respect for your elders? There is real actual trauma. We have people in our community who fought the regime, whose friends died in Tehran jail cells, who are terrified of speaking out, and like, that is real. And people in some ways are like abdicating responsibility to the American political conversation because they want to forget, and that's healing work we have to do within ourselves. And it has to happen immediately because all around us there is American anguish that is unique, that is centuries long, is aimed directly at Black people, counts on us to be part of the project. I'm going to say that again. It counts on us to be part of the project against Black people in America, and us doing nothing is also enough. It's enough to be part of the harm. And so we have to like unpack the generational story as we talk about like what we're doing here. And the last piece I'll touch on, and I know this will probably get expanded out further, but like I've been thinking a lot about how do non-Black Iranian Americans, where do we kind of like find ourselves in the fabric of society? And looking around the Twin Cities, it's like our bodegas and our corner stores and our Middle Eastern delis and our halal marts and all these places. And, you know, George Floyd was murdered outside of this place called Cup Foods, which is like a Middle Eastern market. And they called the cops on George over something that doesn't need police response at all. So, you know, we have a reliance on police in our communities. We have a place in the American project of like state violence against Black people, and where we are in positions of power. And I think about this now as a council member, like in communities where we're fighting to defund the police, there has not been work done on purpose, like by the government, or, you know, by the government, I'll say, to like come up with interventions that are not cops that help keep people safe. We overfund like reactions to what we consider violence while doing violence against Black people. We don't actually fund like community safety. And so when you try to take away police funding, people have equated that with safety so fiercely. And our community also like wants those cops to be at our downtown clubs. Our community often says we want the cops to come and like get these suspicious people out. And if the police aren't there, we follow the Black customers around in the stores. Like it's on and on and on. It's all the things Tehran has said is like part of his life experience and others, many other Black folks. And so we have to like join the conversation in a very like personal way that looks at and interrogates how have we built our lives in America? What is that dependent on? What are we willing to stop and like give up and like change and transform so that we aren't just like replicating the things that exist? We have a responsibility as a community to like redistribute our wealth. We have, when you think about what our voting bloc can bring to the table, there is so much wealth in our community. And we need to figure out how to not just like get Iranian people elected so they can fight the Muslim ban for Iranians. We need to like fund the freedom movement and figure out what that means and use our wealth to do that. Because Black people fight not just for themselves, but for so many other communities historically and now. And like our conversations are still very limited to like, what about us? And we like have a limited view of who we mean by us, right? So I hope this is making sense. Some of this is like my effort at getting all this out during an emotional moment, but I mean, in Minnesota, like the movement for Black lives is like frontline Black and Somali and East African and African American organizers. And then it's also like groups of people who have done work on themselves to be like, here's how I'm going to support the effort, not to be a savior, not to like participate in the same power structures that are part of like the problems, but to actually like be an accomplice. And I've been working to find and make sure that I'm doing my rightful place in that. But when we talk about like a national conversation, we need to build out those pods like everywhere. So this is a lot, but that's what I'm sitting with hearing all this and how I think it connects to like where we are and what we're supposed to be doing.
Sure, but Mitra, it's very easy for the Somalian community, who also at times differentiates itself from the Black American community, and for the East African community who does the same, and the Nigerian community, and everyone to go for Black Lives Matter, because you're looking at a skin tone relation where you're saying, well, we're darker, so Black Lives Matter. How do you impress this upon Iranians who can oftentimes change their names from Farhad to Frank and Mohammed to Mike and Abdi to Mike? And for some reason, Iranians really like the name Mike. I don't know why. But how do you express to them to do the same? Why do they have to be in this battle? And oftentimes, one of the arguments I've received from Iranians is, well, it could be much worse. It could be much worse. We know what it's like for it to be much worse. It was much worse in Iran. This is really good. And I understand and I agree. The difference is when you were in Iran and faced with an oppressive, tyrannical government or any type of suppression of rights, you left. We are here. There is nowhere for us to go. And that conversation, that comparison is the thief of compassion. Yes. Is that it steals from the compassion. If there was a situation, God forbid, where there was a woman who was beaten 10 times by her husband, she gets the strength to divorce that husband and leaves, and then remarries, and now her new husband beats her 3 times a day, you would never turn to her and tell her, oh my gosh, what an amazing husband you have now. At least you're only beaten 3 times instead of 10. It's much better for you. What you would do is you would get angry. You would want to help her. You would want her to help herself. If nothing else, you would feel compassion for her tragedy. That is all we're asking in the Iranian community. I want Iranians to understand awareness is the first step. Awareness, simply just being aware. A lot of Iranians have a lot of thoughts on these subjects and yet very little education on these very subjects. They've never read or learned any actual African-American racial history, civil rights laws. They've never read any of these things and yet have a lot to say because, as Mitra pointed out, they're looking at the lens of their own specific needs and not seeing the greater good. Well, I would like to remind the Iranians, just remember what happens when you look at the specific needs and not the greater good. And if you need a reminder, just look at Iran.
Can I add something there that I
No,
do?
Cyrus, I said everything that needs to be said. Let's,
It's a
Well,
wrap.
I mean, I think, Mitra, you really got us into a very profound discussion. But I want to highlight what I saw on the travel ban, which was lawyers younger than me at the vanguard of it. And what I saw was the word solidarity towards other immigrant groups, fighting the travel ban, not just for us, but the Somalians and the other groups. And when we put together the amicus brief that ended up being the focus of the dissenting justices, the Pars Equality brief, it was all about not just Iranians or people of Iranian descent, but of people. There's a child from Yemen that Justice Ginsburg and the others were focusing on. So we were transcending. And then I saw these young Iranian American lawyers make a voyage from the East Coast and the Midwest and the West to go down to the Texas border when there was a separation of families issue, just volunteering their time as solidarity to another immigrant group being oppressed. I think we have a long way to go because I think we have the paradox of seeing ourselves as very successful and all that and immune. We are not immune. I've been trying to say for 2 years now, we need to think of ourselves as a minority group in terms of and civil rights. We need an Iranian American legal defense fund like there are other defense funds for other ethnic groups in our country, because we are on the verge of getting more and more targeted. If you don't, Trump may not be the worst era that we're in. 10 years from now, there might be something worse. So we really need to be ready. And we are facing, just a few weeks ago, an Iranian was shot in the back and walking down the streets in New York City. So, we're by a police officer. So we are not immune. If we think we're immune, we're fooling ourselves. And so we need solidarity. We need to exude solidarity. And I think that's your point, Mitra, that I just want to echo, that we have done it. We can do much more of that.
Abdi, I want to bring you in. Cyrus is using the word solidarity, exuding solidarity. Tehran talked about awareness. Help the people who are here with us today talk a little bit about awareness and building awareness and what might be done and solidarity.
Well, let me just start by saying, how much I appreciate PAAIA and the fact that Iranian Americans have an organization like PAAIA. I told you all a bit about my work history. For 1 year, I immersed myself in the Iranian American community. I worked at an organization called Parsa Community Foundation. And I will tell you, that was the hardest organizing job I've had. Working within the Iranian American community takes a lot of difficult work. And that's why I'm so grateful to Layla and the whole PAAIA group for what is being done. It's very important for us to have an association that's of and by and for Iranian Americans. Association is the word in the First Amendment. That's the freedom of assembly. And by coming together, you form an association. It's two different words. They both start with A, assembly and association. The only difference is assembly is in person and association is through organizations like this, and the Constitution treats them as the same. So the fact that as Iranian Americans, we come together through and in PAAIA and other associations is in and of itself important, because then we can express ourselves, not just me as Abdi Soltani. I wrote the blog that I wrote for PAAIA because PAAIA is the platform through which we can reach Iranian Americans. I wrote another blog on the ACLU of Northern California website, and I speak to the press otherwise. But I think the important thing there is for us to then infuse our Iranian Americanness with anti-racism. That being Iranian American is not just about glorifying Cyrus the Great and the great empire and our heritage and our poets from 700 years ago. It's not just our food and our hospitality. Being Iranian American, if we're going to associate the word Iranian with American, it has to be an anti-racist association. It can't be we're stepping into this country off the back of everyone else's freedom struggle that preceded us, will take all the benefits and will just be silent and just be free riders. That's not okay. It doesn't live up to our standards as Iranian Americans. Muftkhori is not our standard. So
Well,
I think,
actually, Abdi, you don't know about my family. If anyone wants to invite me over, it's fine. Anyway, please.
well, you're welcome at my place anytime.
Thank you.
But it won't be Muftkhori, Tehran. You earn whatever you get in life. So anyway, my point just being that, you know, it's hard to organize any community, and I think whatever steps we take together, they'll matter and they're worthwhile. So to the Iranian Americans, there's all the folks listening, you don't have to go and drop everything you do and become a civil rights attorney full-time, or not everyone is going to run for office, but in small ways and large, we can each do our part.
We can, and we've seen this before. We've seen it in 2017. Bijan Qaisar in Washington, D.C., it was very close to my heart because, and I'll tell you why, his shooting, his senseless death, this wonderful 25-year-old Iranian American, if you don't know the story, I encourage everyone to go follow up on it, because this was a person who went to high school and graduated and then went to VCU and had no criminal record, because that's one thing they love to do, is discredit people, is they discredit all the people, because that's what makes people feel justified. Just to remind you, however, police are not supposed to kill guilty people either. I just want people to remember that, because they seem to use that to justify. And I know, unfortunately, one day when I am killed because of racism, they're gonna discredit me and use all these things and say all these lies about me, and I won't be there to defend myself either. But with Bijan Qaisar, Bijan was what we see as because there's no perfect victim, as close to a perfect victim as possible. This 25-year-old, wonderful, wonderful human being, part of his family's business, was just driving, gets hit, and then of course the police shoot at his car. Originally they had said 9 times. Once you watch the video in the FBI report, it's 10 times. 4 shots hitting him. He dies 10 hours later after being in emergency room on the respirator. Why is this important? Because the Iranian community was able, you saw a large number of Iranians get together and stand up for something, because they did not think it could happen to them. And a lot of those same Iranians that were there at the Washington Monument, at the Lincoln Memorial, the same Iranians that were there, and I flew in for that event, a lot of the same Iranians were people who had previously posted in regards to other victims when they were Black, that Black people need to learn how to act when they get pulled over, or they need to be appropriate, or somehow we're blaming Black people. But when it happened to an Iranian, that's when they woke up. And that's a saying we actually have, a Farsi phrase. Kesi ke khab hast, mishe bidar kard. Vali kesi ke khodesho mizane be khab, hich vaqt bidar nemishe. What does that mean? It means a person who's asleep can be woken up, but a person who pretends to be asleep will never be woken. Well, now it's time to wake up, Iranian community. Now it's time to stay woke.
Thank you, Tehran. I'm going to jump off of something Mitra was saying, and it's a question I often ask panelists. I often ask, what is your advice to young people? But in this case, I want to ask, what is your message or advice to young people and to old people about getting involved, about learning more and building awareness about themselves, about others, as all that relates to issues of race in America? What is your advice or message to young people and to older people? Who wants to go first? Anybody? Cyrus, do you want to go?
Well, I watched in my own household what happened that first weekend with George Floyd. My son was one of the protesters who went down near the White House at St. John's Chapel 2 days before the famous one when Trump came through. But he explained to me how the police, all dressed in black, that weren't DC police, came charging against the crowd who were peaceful, used tear gas and clubs to beat people. An African-American woman standing next to him, and he was describing it to me that next day, and I was like, I can't believe this is happening in America. And then it just kept escalating needlessly. So that was one reaction. Then I saw my wife just get so demoralized and so hurt by just seeing that video that it was almost like she was physically ill. You know, it just brought this illness, you know, just physically took a toll just seeing that and trying to lift her up. And then my own reaction, I woke up that weekend on that Sunday morning and I just said, you know, you have to turn tragedy into triumph. And we have to use this moment to come up with the big ideas and to come up with solutions to fight for them and to be more successful than times past. The statistics on racial disparities in 1968, the last time there was a big awareness, and 2020 have not changed. They're almost identical. So we have to come up with more deeply rooted solutions. I have no doubt in my mind, Mitra, what you're doing in St. Paul, the ACLU is doing, that Abdi's associated with, and even around what you're doing with your comedy, is getting at the root issues. So I think that's what we have to do now, is take this moment to really not be demoralized, but to be motivated to get at the deep-rooted issues. And I've been personally working on a series of ideas that I think can help us get us there.
Thank you, Cyrus. I want to let everybody who's with us know that we can take your questions. We're taking them, put your questions in the Q&A box there on your Zoom. And if we have time, we will go to your questions and weave them into the conversation as well. So please feel free to post your questions there in the Q&A. Abdi, advice for young and old.
Hi. My biggest advice would just be to just do one thing, choose one thing and do it, commit to one thing and stick with it. So that could be finding an organization and getting involved with it. It could be as simple as donating to a group and doing that consistently. And I would also just encourage people to just do that one thing. I don't want to overdo everything, like just do one thing and choose that and research it. And I would also say, to the extent people are in a business or you're an employer or you're running something, just do something within that circle, within the sphere that you have some responsibility and authority.
Mitra.
Yeah, I'm thinking about just the phrase starting at home. I mean, if you are a young person and a young Iranian American and you are also not Black and you have not Black family members, you are probably the most able to reach your relatives and get your people person in your life. And that means at Thanksgiving and at the Mehuni and at Nowruz and at all these different places where we always come together, that you need to engage with what your relatives are talking about and find out how to hold that conversation, find out how to be aware of where there's trauma that's playing a role, but to not let that be an excuse, because we need to be able to do the process of being a better human and let that transformation happen and push it. All the conversations I've had with my dad over the years, who is my biggest supporter, my best friend, he is, you know, the light of my life. And we have had these really, at times, difficult confrontational conversations about making him recontextualize what he believes about Black people. And it is not Black people's job to do that. It is not fair to put that on them. So you need to do that work in your own community and with your people. If you are starting at home and you have an organization or a business, does your business hire Black people and have equal opportunity? Does your business contribute to the movement in the ways that it can locally? Does your business support white supremacist practices in other ways? What can you do to reform your organizational culture? These are, you know, these are all parts of what build power in the social fabric over time. And it also, in the civil rights movement, it was like a pooling together of community groups and businesses and like people kind of starting where they were around them. And that helped create like the chemical reaction that mattered over time. And then lastly, I'm in local government. And so I would be remiss if I didn't say, map out who represents you. And elections are not where we like get saved or where all our problems end, but having representative anti-racist government is a starting point. It's a precondition for important work that happens. And the work sweeping the country right now is finally to like get cities to move beyond reform and like kind of all these slow tinkering around the edges policies, and to really just be like, we need to fund community safety. We need to fund community stability. And if your council member is not willing to vote to divest from police and reinvest in housing and schools and other things that actually help the community, then you need to look at, you know, if they're movable or if someone else would be better to hold our values up, because power is simply organized people, organized money, and organized story. And we have to build power, and power can be manifested electorally in local elections and government. I am one of those seats now where I live, but I wasn't for a very long time. Most of my life I have not been. And I see how government operates now, up front, close and personal, and I see how possible, how within reach what we want actually really is. But we do have to get these seats. So I think people should start to pay attention to that, and your county attorney and some of these other very, very important, more local offices that actually touch people's lives. And our community sometimes only focuses on the national because of like our foreign policy rightful priorities, right? But we need to start thinking about city, county, and those apparatuses. So those are some suggestions on from me on where I think people could start.
Can I jump in with a question or two from our chat, from our audience, if that's okay? Some of it picks up on parts of what Mitra was just talking about. One of our viewers is asking, how can we connect the issues around race, racism, and the struggle to demilitarize police? Oh, I want to say one thing. It's been 1 month since the death of George Floyd. Do you remember? It's been 6 months since we were at the brink of war with Iran. People thought we were at the brink of war. That was January. So this person is wondering how we can connect issues around race, racism, and the struggle to demilitarize police, and also prevent war with Iran or aggressive policies in other locations. Because the resources that are used for policing, for an example, are an extension of US policy in the Middle East and our excessive military budget. How can we critically engage our community to look at the ways Black and brown people are vilified here and also vilified beyond the borders of the US through foreign policy? Anybody interested in taking a piece of that? Shall I just?
I start off, vote. So unlike people who tend to have a political agenda, I personally don't. I care about principles and not politics. And I want everyone to understand something very simple. Racism, systemic racism, is a bipartisan issue. It is not one party's problem and the other one's the solution. They are both complicit in this problem. There is no, I blame this guy. He's not King Trump. He's not dictator Trump. Once again, we get right back into that conversation. This is a person who's elected. And for all the people who did not like President Trump being elected or were surprised, that just means that you do not know the United States and you do not know your country or the country that you've immigrated to as much as you think. And it's that simple. This is a person who is supported by Congress and senators, and it all starts with the Mitra level. Start from the ground up. Mitra's more important in a lot of ways than a presidential policy because it starts from the ground. No, we all know all these politicians now, de Blasio, and everyone knows these names. We never knew before, by the way, we never knew. So know the names of your local council members, your local board members, your local community leaders, your mayor, and write them. Start being active politically. Iranians, we need to be active politically. We are not. A lot of Iranians just kind of sit back and go, I wish someone would do something about this. Well, look in the mirror, Babak, you're someone. Do something about it.
We have several questions about doing something in the more interpersonal way in family, as Mitra was just talking about. Again, 2 or 3 people asked in different ways, so I'll try to consolidate, or maybe I'll just pick one because she's in high school. Here's one from a person who just graduated from high school. Her dad immigrated from Tabriz when he was 19, studied in London, came to America, very set on his ways. Whatever happens, happens. Kind of closed-minded, she says. She's attempted to educate him, but he said, how do I connect him so he empathizes and sees the problem? I've tried to connect him through the regime in Iran, but it goes through him. He can be very racist, unfortunately. And then other people have asked similar questions about how to talk to Iranian relatives on the issue of race and Black Lives Matter. And if you can't get them to understand the importance, what can you do? Anybody? Abdi?
You know, it's easy for me to be on this screen and talk through the screen to the person who asked the question. And there are a lot of resources out there that I would just encourage you to look at. I think that there's different ways of coming at things, and one is just the basic issue of self-interest. And how do you define your self-interest? And I don't know, my question to Iranian Americans is pretty straightforward. Like, recognize that you can be the target of discrimination based on national origin. And there's plenty of examples of it. Unless you want to just disappear into America and lose any sense of who you once were and are. And is that what you want? And the America that would contain within it Iranian American as a concept has to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic America on which everyone can stand on equal footing. So, you know, to the high school student who wrote that, you know, you can find me online, and if I can be of any help to you, please do, and feel free to reach out, and I'll talk to your dad, and I'll tell him why I care and why I think he.
Yeah, I can tell Abdi.
There.
Abdi's not dealing with Persian parents all the time. If you talk to her dad, first of all, if you talk to her dad, kotak mekhore, she's getting spanked. Like, you have to talk to Persian dads like Persian dad talk. So you have to say things in terms that Persian dads understand. I think I'm an expert at this. You have to be like, Baba, agar siyaha nabudan chai nadashtim. That's how you have to explain. You have to be like, if there weren't Black people, we wouldn't have chai. Everyone loves chai. We need chai. Don't you like chai? You have to start explaining to Iranian parents in terms that they completely understand. For example, we all know it's very hard for Iranian parents to understand how, like, the American government can affect Black people, because Iranians will say, they will actually put themselves in Black people's shoes and be like, I don't understand why they don't just do this. Well, it's not enough to just walk a mile in someone's shoes. You have to walk with their legs and their knowledge of how to walk. So even when you have conversations with Iranian immigrants who came here with nothing, they left their country, they only had two $1 bills, and they gave one away, so they had nothing, and they walk here all the way from Iran. Every time you hear these amazing stories of how they got to this country through challenge and then were able to triumph, you're also leaving out that their parents owned businesses in Iran, or that they were doctors in their country, or everyone was a general. Everyone was a general. So that education, of that knowledge, is something you can't take away from people. How do you can't take away the knowledge. So you have to explain to them that also in America, Black people were unfortunately not only oppressed, but every time they tried to build something for themselves, it was destroyed. Very similar to how America and English went to Iran and destroyed every time Iran tried to make something of itself. They would go in and do the same thing. You have to equate it to things that Iranians understand. Use those terminology, like, see what they've done to Iran and made Iranians look bad and how they affected Iran. They had a 400-year head start on Black people in this country. And it's all for money. It's all for money. They want to steal all the money from the Black community. That's why the hood is so poor, but they keep opening businesses there. Because if it's so poor, then why do you keep opening businesses? That's what they do. They try to make Black people look bad the same way they try to make Iranians look bad. Black people aren't busy stealing any more than Iranians in Iran are busy burning American flags. No one does it. And then when they do it, they only show that part. And then you have to try to slowly reason with your Persian blah, blah. And then you have to make it look like it was his idea. It was his idea. That's the secret. You make it look like, oh, Bubba, you're right. We shouldn't be racist anymore. Let's not use the word tang for Asian people because it means tight eyes. How racist is that? Bubba, you're brilliant. That's how that works.
Most qualified panelist.
I second that.
I'm telling you, you have to know.
But I really like what you're saying too, because it's like a lot of folks that I grew up with like pretend like they don't know about race, or we sort of, but it's like, yeah, you do, because you have all these words and you feel comfortable saying them and you are just very wild about it. So I appreciate like all that you're bringing up, because our community does know. It's that the norms and the constructions around it have just become okay. And like, that's where the confrontation is important, because it's actually not. And it does, it costs people their lives. It costs Black people their lives. It was very heavy for me when you said, Tehran, like, when I am killed because of racism. Like, who on this panel can relate and just be able to say when, not if? I mean, it was a small moment that passed, and it was a micro moment, and I feel it, and it's heavy. And so our community does know. I put in the chat, like, there are some Farsi words that like are sort of 2.0. I am like household Farsi kid, like bala, pain, bukhor, ziyad, bishtar, nakon. Like all the, the Farsi words I know are like my grandma raising me Farsi, and it's not political newscast Farsi, and it's not like intersectionality, but there are ways we can make it accessible, and I agree with that so much. So thank you for that.
I know all those big words. So if you ever need help, let me know. I will explain na barobari. I will explain bi-idolati. I will explain all of those words for all of you. So
Amazing.
if you ever need me, just slide into my inbox, and I will let you know what words to use.
Great, I will.
Thank you, Mitra. If you need bala pain, I got that too.
Bala pain.
Bala pain. But of course, Iranian families know what racism is. That's why I'm so rare. That's the whole concept, right? That I'm Black and Iranian. Oh my God, that's so crazy. Well, the whole idea of me being Black and Iranian is because Iranians have no problems when their daughters bring home a white guy from college. That's something we're okay. We've learned to deal with that. So if they bring a Black guy home from college, then the names start getting thrown out. Well, that's racism. That's where it starts. It starts in the home. You want to know how to fix racism? Look in the mirror. The mirror is not just for reflection. Thankfully, it's also for correction. And when you see something wrong when you look in the mirror, you can fix it, whether it's your color or your attitude. So look in the mirror and see where it really all started.
Here's one that might jump off of what you're saying right now, Tehran. This viewer is wondering what your thoughts are on Iranians' understanding of race. They say that we are a relatively single race country, so appreciating the lived experience of other races is not woven into our culture. We're immigrants, but we don't associate that otherness with race. My impression is that we see culture more than race. Is it possible that that is why our heart is not in this moment?
It's so interesting you asked about that. Thinking that Iran is a single race country, or mostly a single race country, is the first step into not understanding Iran. اتفاقاً قدرت ایران فرق نژادیه, is the strength of Iran is actually the differences of races and cultures that are all within Iran and know themselves as Iranian. And I always say this to people, especially to my dad, Iran faqat Tehran nist. Even though I'm Tehran, Iran is not just Tehran. There are a lot of parts of Iran with a lot of different ethnicities and cultures of people, whether it's Kurds, Armenians, whether it's Turks, who we all know because there are so many racist Turkish jokes. That's another place to look at the concept of humor. Who does that bother? The same way that we make jokes about Black guys in nice cars getting pulled over by the police. Ha, ha, ha. It's so funny until you're the Black guy in a nice car getting pulled over by the police. That's where it all starts. We have so many different ethnicities and cultures within Iran itself that have all helped shape and form Iran and Iranians. That's what makes it so different. That's why, actually, that we're not Arab. If you look at every other great empire in the world, if you look at the Egyptians or the Lebanese or the Syrians or Iraqis, Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, they were great empires just like the Persian Empire. But what's the difference? Why did Iran not become Arab? Because if you ask them today, they will all simply say they're Arab. Because Iran had a Hafez, because Iran had a Ferdowsi, because we had a sense to keep this culture alive amongst so many different groups of people that it was impossible to remove, whether it's religiously different groups of people, culturally, ethnically different groups of people. That's what we were able to do. And that's why those original words of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, such a simple, the most basic of all Iranian tenets, ring so much more true today than ever before in history.
Wow, thank you. We're getting close to 6:30. I'm in the West Coast. We're getting close to being done with our time. So I want to give everybody a few minutes, if you like, to make a closing statement. And then Samara is going to have a couple of words to close out the panel. This has been really provocative and really heartful and really, in some ways, really emotional and really heartfelt. And I really appreciate everybody opening up and sharing and talking and communicating this with our audience, and we hope that we can expand this conversation and keep it going with future dialogues. But right now we're going to take if anyone has final words they want to say, I can go around the circle one more time. Cyrus, do you want to give us some closing words?
As Tehran was speaking, I kept thinking to myself that, Tehran, you should be on every college campus, every high school, every junior high school we can get you on, because I think your message will resonate with so many people and young people and get them thinking. So I just, it's a pleasure to be on the program with you and Abdi and Mitra. But I think getting your words out, to younger people, would be great service.
I appreciate you.
Thank you for all you do, Cyrus. We appreciate you very much. Abdi.
One of the amazing civil rights leaders and attorneys that is in our country is Brian Stevenson, and he talks about the word proximity, which is just of getting ourselves out of our bubbles and getting closer to, in his case, he talks about people who are incarcerated. But I think that for the folks who've been on this conversation and you're here to the end, I think just get closer to the Black community, Black-led organizations, Black businesses, Black organizations, and build relationships and get involved and be an ally. And do whatever you're going to do it with some modesty, do it with some humility, and just build relationships and get on the path of learning. I'm so inspired by Cyrus and Tehran and Mitra. I'm just writing down the things they're saying. I've been working full-time for civil rights since I was 18 years old, one way or another, and I'm on a constant learning journey. So to just say for everyone who's here, just be part of the solution and take some steps in that direction, and that's a good start or a good continuation of what you've already been doing.
Thank you, Abdi. Mitra?
Just very humbled and appreciative of the chance to be part of this discussion. I think it's a jumping off point. It's not the beginning and end. We need to keep having this conversation within our community, and we need to have it urgently. It can't just be conversation. We need to take action. So, I'm on Twitter at Mitra Jalali. I'm pretty findable on there. And as people are sorting through all this, I would offer just myself as continued person to process with. It took me, let's see, I'm 34 now, and it took me like the majority of my lifetime to come to the understanding I have. I wasn't born understanding these things. I was moved and changed, and I unlearned things and I relearned better things. And that human work, it's done with people who are willing to be in it with you, hold up grace and confrontation and really take that on. But you don't have to be perfect to do good right now either, but let's do the work to get our community together and get us off the sidelines, because a lot of folks have said many of us are not activated. There are a lot of us that are working really hard and leading work and leading alongside Black freedom fighters who've been in this for a really long time, but we need to do so much more. I think we're late to this conversation, like I said. So I'm just feeling the urgency, and I really appreciate. And Tehran, I just followed you on Twitter and Instagram. Because I'm just like obsessed with like your everything. So thank you for like holding an extra line in this conversation. I mean, I really appreciate you a lot.
I appreciate all of you actually, and I hope that people realize how amazing everyone on this panel, from Shirley to Cyrus to Mitra to Abdi, have been just putting this together. But not only that, but their expertise and their continued fight for the Iranian community for the overall community and for the betterment of this world, because every Iranian parent loves their child more than anyone else. That's why we all still live at home. We are the real Iranian hostage crisis. We're never allowed to leave. You love us so much. So why not make this world a better place for each and every one of us by making the world a better place, period. And we can do this together. When I was a child, there was this Hafiz poem that always stuck in my head, and it said, Yari andar kas nemi binamo, yaran ro che shod. Dusti ke akhar amad, dustaran ro che shod. The concept is, where has camaraderie gone? Where has friendship gone? And when I look amongst everyone on this panel and everyone who's joined this chat and organizations such as PAAIA, that's where I see friendship. That's where I see unity. That's where I see communication. And communication and unity combined becomes community. And that's what we are, is an Iranian American community for Iranians in America, but also for the world. And we are the example. So be the change. It's that simple. Just be the change. And understand, when you hear things like Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean Black Lives Matter only. It doesn't mean Black Lives Matter more. It simply means Black Lives Matter also. Also. And that's important. And it's sad that we even have to remind people, because one day, if you don't start now, we will be reminding people how Iranian lives matter as well. And then there will be no one there to speak up for you. So speak up now.
Thank you, Tehran. Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, Mitra. Thank you, Abdi. Thank you, PAAIA. This has been a really enriching conversation. And again, not the end of conversation, and conversation that hopefully leads to action and to more greater good. I'm going to turn it over to Samira, who is going to have some more remarks and wrap us up. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you again to my dear friends, Shirley, Cyrus, Mitra, Abdi, and Tehran. Thank you, Layla and PAAIA, for making this a priority and bringing this group together. I hope, as we've mentioned, that we can keep this discussion going in our own lives, because we must all do better if we want to see actual change. If you have not done so, and you are not registered or signed up for the PAAIA newsletter, please do so now. Layla will share a list of resources shared by the panelists tomorrow. And before we say goodbye, I promised I would remind you all to fill out your 2020 census if you have not done so yet. While you are still in front of your computers, tablets, smartphones, go to 2020census.gov. The census results dictate the amount of federal funds that go to your community. That means your sidewalks, your schools, your highways. It determines how many members of your House of Representatives go to your state. Again, the deadline has been extended to August 11th, and it only takes a few minutes. I promise you that. And if you haven't registered to vote yet, please do so as soon as you can. Get your family members to register to vote. Talk to your friends about it. Most citizens think that their vote doesn't matter, but I can tell you as a former campaigner, many local elections are determined by just 100 or so votes. Some of them are even just a handful of votes. Your vote does matter, and it is very important. This isn't just for your president, but for your local elections too. As Mitra and Tehran noted, the individuals sitting in your local elected positions are actually more crucial and have more impact in our day-to-day lives, like your county and your state's attorneys, your judges, your sheriffs, your commissioners, your school boards. Just vote. There's no excuse. Vote. Change takes time, but we all need to do some work and be engaged. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Thank you, and I hope you all have a safe and happy, healthy holiday weekend. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, y'all. Talk to you soon.